If you have a Bible and you like following along with the reading, please turn in it to James chapter 1. This is where we're going to spend our time. And I've got a kind of a long preamble today. Part of me wants to say I'm sorry about that, but I'm not really, because it's kind of important. So just think along these lines with me as I go before we start into the text and the sermon. G.K. Chesterton, whom you may have never read, I love G.K. Chesterton's writings, and if anybody ever wants to read anything of G.K. Chesterton, my advice would be to just pick up the book Orthodoxy. That'll give you a really good taste of G.K. Chesterton, whom C.S. Lewis describes as one of his favorite authors. He says this in defining what a promise is. Now think about this as the definition of a promise. He says, one making an appointment with themselves for a distant time and place. Just think about what that means. In other words, we're saying to ourselves as we make promises in the open air, that we are promising ourselves. We're saying, I'm going to keep that appointment with myself at that distant time. So if I stand in front of a pastor and get married and say, I do, which again I should think would be better said, I will, but nevertheless, I'm making a promise to keep that appointment down the road in being faithful in that marriage. That's what I'm doing. I like that definition. And it's up to us to keep a promise, right? Or it's not a promise at all. It's just some words strung together. So our saying that we are followers of Jesus is a kind of a promise that we're keeping all the time, to stand and as an agreement between our words and our actions throughout our life. We keep that promise multiple times a day, I hope, in some of the small areas of living. So the question then becomes, do those two things agree? Do our words and our actions agree as we move through life? Now, with that in mind, I want you to also think of another thing before we get into the text. And this is really important. If a person does not believe that there is a God, if there's no God, God doesn't exist, then there are some things that follow from that, and they're really important to think about. There's a Christian professor by the name of Carlisle Marney, who you've probably never heard of. However, he says this about what I'm describing here. If you take God out of the picture of the universe that we have, all that's left is the universe. That's all that's left, the material objects, right? He says this, if that's the truth about the universe, humanity is an accident in the world, a world which is foreign to humanity. And humanity is purposelessly produced by forces over which humanity has no control and no responsibility, and no capacity to be responsible to. A chance deposit on the surface of the world carelessly thrown up by the same forces that rust iron and ripen corn. Now that is a potent description of what it means to say that there is no God, and that's what the universe would actually be. But now think about this. If that's true about the world, then nothing matters. Nothing. Nothing you decide to do or don't decide to do, nothing you think, nothing you say, no activity you have in your life, nothing. Your life itself does not matter at all. Now contrast that with the biblical picture here for a moment. The biblical picture is this. One, there is a God, and that God proclaims himself to be the creator of everything. So therefore, we are part of that creation. We are created beings. We're not just happenstance accidents here on this planet. The second thing it means is we are ends, not means. That's very important. You know, if you take God out of the picture and you want to exploit somebody else for your purposes, why is that a problem? Right? If nothing matters, who cares? I mean, Hitler's point of view or Pol Pot's point of view is just as good as anybody else's point of view, right? If we're just material objects, rocks don't care, trees don't care. If we're material objects alone, then we shouldn't care either. Why bother? That person who was at the 14th Street Bridge in Washington, D.C. when I was living there, who kept helping people onto the ladder when that plane went down and all those people were in that 32-degree water. He kept pulling people to the ladder, other people, and then the next time the helicopter came, he was gone. He gave his life for those people. That was the stupidest thing in the world to do if God doesn't exist, right? You should have swatted at the people who were coming for the ladder and get them out of the way. It's all about you, because nothing matters. But that's not the way the world is if God exists. We are ends, not means. Thirdly, we're spiritual. That means we're separated from everything else on the planet, whether it's alive or not. There is nothing on this planet that compares to humanity in terms of who we are, because there's a part of us that has a connection to God who is there that none of the rest of the whole of the world has, so far as we know. And that we are lastly greater than the sum of our experiences and our biological parts. Now, a band I love, Pink Floyd. I love Pink Floyd. Roger Waters was the primary lyricist in Pink Floyd, and in his song, The Dark Side of the Moon, he said, all that you touch and all that you see is all your life will ever be. Well, he's wrong. That's a great song, but he's really wrong about that, because we aren't just blobs of living matter that experience things and then just die with all the experiences. We're not. We're created beings, and God says that we do matter. So let's take all that into mind, and now let's look at the text. James chapter 1, I'll begin reading in verse 19. Understand this, my dear brothers and sisters. Let every person be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. For human anger does not accomplish God's righteousness. So put away all filth and evil excess, and humbly welcome the message implanted within you, which is able to save your souls. Be sure to live out the message, and do not merely listen to the message and so deceive yourselves. For if someone merely listens to the message and does not live it out, they're like someone who gazes at their face in a mirror and then gazes at themselves and goes out immediately and forgets what sort of person they are. But the one who peers into the perfect law of liberty and fixes their attention there and does not become a forgetful listener, but one who lives it out, they will be blessed in all that they do. If someone thinks they're religious and does not bridle their tongue, they so deceive their heart, and their religion is futile. Pure and undefiled religion is before God is this: to care for orphans and widows in their misfortune, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. So this tells us that the biblical picture is we are responsible to God, and we're responsible to other people. We're created for two distinct relationships on this planet. One is with God, and the other is with other people. It's very simple, and James is making that case. You see that God promised things to Israel. You notice something about God's promises to Israel. They were conditional for Israel's blessing. They were not conditional that they would be kept. No conditions could change God's mind that he would keep those promises to Israel no matter what they did. He was going to keep that promise. And Israel was his. His presence was with them, but he withdrew his presence, his blessing, many times through their history because they didn't keep the conditions under which they had been recipients of the promise. But that didn't do anything to God's promise. He still kept it and will keep it. As Paul says, all Israel will be saved. Period. Just a flat statement. That's the end of the conversation. Think of it what you will. It doesn't matter what we think. But this responsibility we've been given to God and to others is kind of a paradox in a way, because on the one hand, we're commanded to be responsible to other people and to God, but on this hand, we're not able. There's a kind of a paradox there. I'm not able to keep my promises with God. I'm not able to be responsible to God. I'm not able to be responsible to other people. God has to enter into that equation and help me do those things. I'm not able to do it by myself. And James says, if you read the whole book, his whole letter, that if we're guilty of failure at one point, we're just guilty, period. That's the end of it. Doesn't matter how many of the laws we break, how many things we do that are unrighteous, we're guilty of the whole thing. Guilty of one, guilty of it all. And we're judged, according to the text we just read, by the law of liberty. Now that is a very ruthless standard. Very ruthless. It's so ruthless because in the end, we're not given absolute direct instructions. You know, if you read the Quran, you get the rules. There they are. Doesn't matter what you or I might think of them. If we're a Muslim, we get the rules and that's it. The Bible's not like that. There are commandments in the Bible for sure, but you'll notice something about those commandments. We don't keep them. And yet, God's grace says, if we come to him and confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and cleanse us for all unrighteousness. And that verb there is it keeps on cleansing us. It's not something that just happens once. So this law of liberty is really hard because I'm free to pick and choose. I'm free by God's giving you and me the capacity as causal agents in the world. We can make things happen, and we do. Some of them are good, some of them are not. And this standard of the law of liberty is so ruthless and so difficult. How many of you have seen the movie regarding Henry? Yeah. It's a great movie. Harrison Ford, I encourage you to watch it. It's a great movie to break your heart. He's a lawyer who is a ruthless, cynical, vindictive, angry guy. And he goes to the convenience store down the street to buy a pack of smokes. Now that bothers me right away because I hate smoking. But nevertheless, even when it's in a movie, I can't stand it. I can't even stand to watch it. But that's what he's doing. And he goes in there, and it's during the process of it being robbed. And the robber shoots him in the forehead. He doesn't even know he's been shot. He walks out on the sidewalk and collapses. And the whole rest of the movie is this lawyer named Henry, Harrison Ford, recovering from this brain injury that he's had. And at the end of the movie, he starts to reclaim his cognition, but it's completely changed his personality. Now he's just a totally fun-loving, nice guy that his wife loves, his children love. He's just lovable. And I have said through my life as a Christian, I would like it if God would allow me to have, my wife's shaking her head, if God would allow me to have a head injury that would just knock me happy. Just enough, to just knock me happy so that it would be okay. I wouldn't worry about struggling to live the law of liberty. I would just live it as best I could and let God take care of the rest. But so far it hasn't happened. But that flows from something very specific. My desire to be in heaven. That's where it comes from. That's all it is. I want to be in heaven. Now, all of this that James gives us here is really down-to-earth stuff. I mean, it's not hard. He tells us 3 specific things here in this text, if I've read it correctly. One thing is control what we say. I understand that. Meet the needs of others. I understand that. If you want to sum them up, the third thing is generally live rightly. Now, that's not very hard to think about in terms of understanding. But these things are what define us as followers of Jesus, right? That's how people will know that we're followers of Jesus, is they see these things in us and they say, how come you make this decision and not that one? And we get the chance to say, because I believe God is pleased in me making the decision that way. That's a good thing. James makes the contrast here between the inward truth that we understand and it not being shown outwardly in any way. There's a problem there. And as Jesus himself said to us all, he said, look, just got to get it in your heads. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is very weak. So there's so many texts in the Bible, Romans chapter 7, where you see this contrast between what we think about and what we think about ourselves and who we actually are. There's a tension there. We're living the law of liberty, and we're not doing a really good job about it much of the time. I'm not. I mean, we fail. We fail a lot. But there's something to be said here for taking James. I knew a believer once who was like this. Knew him very, very well. And you could see it in their life. They were a believer, but they didn't have any of the sense of God's Spirit making them joyful or happy-clappy or any of that. But they did have one aspect of it, that was they obeyed. They were very, very raw, what I would call rawly obedient. And God rewards that over time. So don't think there's no value in just taking what James says and obeying this as something that God is telling us. There's a picture here that you might not be aware of. When James says, put away all filthiness, that's a really weird term there because of what it actually says in terms of what he's communicating. He's given us a word picture. If you don't know Greek, you wouldn't catch this, but he's saying the filthiness that he speaks of is the same thing that would mean one's ears are clogged up with wax. That's the filthiness. In other words, that we're not hearing God saying things to us. Put away all filthiness so that we're not deafened to God's voice. So let's take a look at the other things that James tells us here. He says, control our speech. Well, yeah, I mean, that's pretty simple, I guess. It can be simple. Sometimes it gets real complicated. But you know, there's an element of it that I find even more deadly than it is when we say things to other people and hurt them. And that's in the arena of self-deception, where we tell ourselves things that aren't true, and we actually believe them over time. It's easy to think ourselves right before God, right? And tell ourselves we are, and yet not be. How many people are in congregational settings week in and week out who, for whatever reason, tell themselves that they're right with the Lord, but they have no relationship with Him at all? But you see, that's where congregational life becomes so important. The Bible tells us, I don't know if you're aware of this or not, do you know what went away when the veil was torn from top to bottom? The laity. Christianity destroys the laity. There are no lay people in Christianity. Everybody's a priest. Everybody. We're all a priesthood of believers. That's what we are. Peter says it directly. So nobody is a theological or moral island anymore. That means that if you see something in me, you have an obligation to say something to me about it. If there's something in my life that looks to you to be immoral or undesirable or against what you believe God would say and have me do, then you need to say something to me. And likewise, I'm under obligation for you the same way. We're a priesthood of believers. How do you function as a priest for somebody? You stand in the gap between them and God and help them out. They're saying things we can't see. I love what Henry Van Dyke, who was a pastor, then he was an ambassador, who said of this very text. He said, here's my advice. He said, never believe a bad report about anybody unless you absolutely know it to be true. And never give a bad report about anybody unless it is absolutely necessary. And remember this, God is listening to you as you do. Yeah. That's pretty good advice if you ask me. And then James says, let's meet the needs of others. We're commanded by Scripture to do that. I was reading in one of these little booklets, you know, like guideposts or Daily Bread, one of these little readers that you get, you pick them up at the doctor's office. It said this of a church where this person was attending, I guess, is what they were writing about. And it said this: the service we had this Sunday was very inspiring, and the singing was awesome, heavenly. The prayers were contagious. The preaching was potent. When we were leaving church, though, there was a little lady in unkempt clothing standing at the edge of the graveyard fence weeping, and only one person stopped to see what was going on. So there's a place where we can lie to ourselves about, I hear people say this, and I don't like this saying. Ooh, we had church today. Well, maybe we did, maybe we didn't. But if we come by somebody who's in need like that, and nobody stops to see what's going on, did we really have church at all? I think that's a reasonable question to ask. You see, James is making assumptions here. He's assuming that God exists. He's assuming that God is our Father in heaven. He's assuming that God is causing us growth as disciples if we're following Him. So here we come into the world as human beings. We start out as infants, really, who know nothing, think nothing, as far as we can tell. They don't have any even sense of self-consciousness. But then, as we become toddlers, we start to realize that other people are looking at us. So we start to have an awareness that the things we do matter in the world. And then we grow to adulthood, and as we grow to adulthood, we bang into other people through our lives. And pretty soon we become things like embarrassed, or our feelings are hurt. And we realize that there's a sense of self-consciousness that's both good and bad. The good self-consciousness is we want to be aware of what we're doing in the world and how it affects other people. The bad side is we become so self-conscious we can't see anything else. And we become broken and guarded adults. Now, we discover that brokenness and guardedness because of the pain we feel when we bang into other people and we get hurt. But think about some of the things we choose to do. For instance, we get married. You know what marriage, beyond the fact of the love and everything as we've been talking about it in Sunday school, is? It's a desire that we're expressing, that we want somebody in this world to know us completely and yet love us anyway. And to be confident in that. To just have that as an assumption. We want it, we crave it. That sense of the innocence of childhood where we just assumed that we were loved. Hopefully, if we had a good set of parents. But that gets eroded through time, and we become guarded. Carlisle Marney, the person I quoted earlier, said this. He said, most of us know enough to be better persons than we are. I think that's so true. You know, we do. We know, right? He says, the war is won, but the battles aren't over. And boy, is that ever true. The law of liberty is that we are now empowered by God to do God's will. It's just up to us to choose it always. And James is admonishing us here to keep our promises to ourselves. Keep those appointments with ourselves to be the followers of Jesus that we're supposed to be, not in the big things, but in the normal, mundane, small things where it's really the hardest to do. Because we just forget. But God, fortunately, is always new and always available and will always help us in those realms. I don't know if I've said anything about anything you've got a question about, if you want to speak with me.